Okay, next we have John Gustavson, and presenting on International Valuation Problems, Solutions by IMVAL. John Gustavson holds Masters of Science degrees in both geology and engineering. After running his consulting company, Gustavson Associates, for almost 30 years, he now focuses his semi-retirement on valuation of many mineral commodities, both locally and internationally. He has taught and published extensively on mineral valuation and served as expert witness in many courts. In 1991, he was the founding president of the International Institute of Minerals Appraisers, which since 2001 has provided these valuation sessions at the SME Annual Conference. John is a registered member of SME and the co-chair of the SME Valuation Standards Committee. Please welcome John.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Evan. I had a pleasure talking with you this morning about some very specific United States valuation problems of minerals. Now this afternoon we're going international, and can I somehow get the slide screen up, maybe by doing this? I thought I had it. Down there? Down there, that one? Yeah?
There we go.
Yep, thanks a lot. Okay, so right now we'll talk international, and this is actually the first of two talks. My co-author, Fred Pirkle, will take the rostrum here for the next presentation after this, and we'll both be dealing with IMVAL. IMVAL is a new kid on the block since 2012. Let's see if this one works. Yeah. And IMVAL deals with, hey, what if you have to do the mineral valuation, not just in the United States or North America, but if you have to do it internationally. So there was a conference in Brisbane about 2012. So I'm here going to give these talking points about what happened at that conference, what happened afterwards, and what IMVAL is, and how IMVAL can be of help. These are the talking points. And I start with that we at IMVAL are focusing on standards after the reserve estimates have been done under their standards. In other words, follow on from CRISCO or PRMS. Okay, so we have those, we know that, and we must comply with international standards there, either from CRISCO or from PMRS. Now, the next task then, particularly for IMVAL, is to somehow harmonize, that's the key word, valuation across international borders and languages. That's the key point, so we can put dollar values on. Now, this is, of course, one of the reasons here. We have globalization, both of mining and oil and gas, and that includes international financing and many other things, litigation, what have you, nationalization, and things like that. So we need to have the ability to work across the borders. And why is that important to have that harmonization? Because we find that if we go out in the world, hey, some places valuation is synonymous with appraisal, as used, for example, here in the USA. In other jurisdictions, the word appraisal, Australia, for example, is used for what we term evaluation here in the United States. So you can see we don't really have harmonization across. Also, a person called a valuer, that is unknown in American English. But the rest of the world, in our country, we call that person an appraiser. But in the rest of the world, the word valuer is the term, even if we don't find it in a US dictionary as a word. Clearly, harmonization, and look at my problem here, do I spell it with Z or an S, right? So the problem is all over. Now, IMVAL particularly focuses on what types of values are we going to talk about, because there are many types of value. Value is really a generic term, and it can apply to any one or all of these. I don't have time here to go through them, but I'm sure you heard them. We are predominantly in mineral appraisal talking about market value when we're talking about the standards. But there's a lot to speculate about here. And then in addition to these here, we may also add those things that are specified in various national codes and standards. So what is IMVAL really? Well, I mentioned it was formed in 2012 in Brisbane, and Fred Pirkle was there, as well as some other people in the audience. And they were formed by these 6 institutes, of which one of them, namely RICS here, the UK-based RICS, pulled back and just took an observer role. But the other 5 were basically there and said, hey, we've got to make some bridges internationally, start understanding each other. So today, IMVAL can be viewed as this. On the actual ground are SIMVAL, Canada, SAMVAL, Africa, VALMIN, which is a combination of several things in Australia. And then in close orbit, we have a couple of institutes, SME, who's our host today, IIMA, who is putting these valuation sessions together. And then to that, we can add a number of observers. So we have the members, the 5 members, and a number of observers. Observers in a wider orbit here. We have, for example, Society of Petroleum Evaluation Engineers. They occasionally also do valuation, you know, the narrower putting dollar value on it. So therefore they're an observer. SAMOG, that's the South African Oil and Gas Institute, that also currently are taking a wider orbit as an observer. And over here, IVSC, that's the International Valuation Standards Committee, based in London, and actually puts standards for not only real estate, but also business valuation standards, personal property standards, and so on. And in other words, they are a big umbrella over everything, but with very, very little attention to minerals. Fortunately, they are now an observer of what's going on in the minerals thing. RICS is still an observer, and of course is subscribed to by many, many people around the world for broad valuation, and admittedly, they have started putting focus on minerals in their red book, as we call it. Anyway, here comes the dragon, the tiger, and the dragon from China, and there's an institute in China, and the acronym reads something like the Chinese Chinese something with appraisal and mineral resources and so on. They are right now about to become maybe a full member, or at least an observer. Okay, and then for the long run, we have our lens pointed to something even outside these parties here, namely the accounting profession, because as we all know, the accountants take numbers from us minerals appraisers, and somehow they end up on the balance sheet of publicly traded companies. Well, how does that take place? What steps are they taking? Big, big mystery sometimes, and we are trying slowly to come and say, hey guys, we know that for every 1 minerals appraiser, there are 100 accountants, or God knows, they are many, many, many more than us. We're just saying, hey, could we communicate? So maybe the gap that we have between us can be somewhat shortened. Anyone who's interested more in exactly how we're trying to do that, I'm giving a talk at the ASA, American Society of Appraisers, one-day energy conference in Houston on May the 2nd. And half the audience there are going to be accountants. So, you know, I'm trying to learn to communicate here. Purpose of IMVAL, get a common template or standard for mineral property valuation. That's the IMVAL template. Here you have the 3rd edition of it. It's been through 3 editions now, and it's a living document. It's being improved from time to time. Okay, purpose is then to harmonize valuation terms and definitions. also, and then we're well underway. It's principles-based, and it's for use as global reference to form basis for national codes of valuation of mineral properties. That template sets levels of standards and guidelines. It harmonizes the international standards for valuation, which is done under the international valuation standards, promulgated every couple of years, updated by the London-based International Valuation Standards Committee. And there's a 2017 issue. So the template we're talking about, IMVAL template, is making reference as often as possible to IVS. We are just more the specialist focusing on how is it if you have to value minerals in contrast to all the many other things that's being valued. Okay, also it sets minimum requirements whenever countries come up with national codes, then we try to have an influence and set at least minimum requirements. And it consists of current preferred practices, so therefore we update from time to time. It's for global use as a reference under an umbrella and in which to adopt national codes. It's a consensus of best practices, and consequently we right now also have a Chinese version, an unofficial Chinese translation of the template, and Canberra may become a member or an observer at least. What is IMVAL not? Well, it's not a stand-alone reporting code. It's not that. There's a bunch of other things. So it isn't intended to supersede any of those national codes, but rather to influence and complement them, to harmonize, go towards the common goal, speak a more common language when it comes to mineral appraisal. It's not taking precedence over any legal or regulatory requirements in specific jurisdictions. It's linked actually to the SME website, or is supposed to be. Here's the SME website. Here you have the source, where you should go. You know, you get to the next sheet, and down here, lo and behold, that's where it should be. It's listed, but it's not there. We've got to ask SME what's going on. Tomorrow morning we have a committee meeting, and that'll be brought up. Hey, what can we do since SME says, hey, yeah, we subscribe to the template and to IMVAL, but it's not attached. It is attached, by the way, to the IIMA website. Okay, not yet. Now, valuation versus evaluation. I always harp a little bit on that. It's distinctly different, because evaluation, that's the broad physical description, economic, any kind of assessment, typically for an FID, or maybe it's only at the scoping study, pre-feasibility of physics. It's really trying to answer, just here, it's trying to answer what does this project entail? How big is the project? And it tries to say, might it be feasible to do it? In contrast, and in addition to that, valuation is much more narrow. It's the estimation of the value of mineral property. What's the cash value of this particular property? There's three fundamental principles underlying IMVAL's whole concept and work. I just mentioned the top of them here, because we're talking about competence is one of the pillars, competence of the appraiser and of any experts. The second one is materiality, to be sure to document all relevant information and assumptions. And third, the transparency of the valuation process and the report. I am not going to deal more with that, because this particular thing is the subject of Fred Pirkle's talk in a couple of minutes. So we'll skip that and instead go here to the principles that are the subject of this following paper that Fred is giving. We instead are going to look at each country may have its own standards. but IMVAL is not intended to supersede any of those. Absolutely not. Stages of mineral evaluation, and I'll get close to finishing with that, so Fred can have some time. Stages of mineral evaluation, very important for the highest and best use determination that we need to make. You know, it's got to be an effective date. What is the highest and best use as of that date? That's the stage of the mineral evaluation. Now, the Supreme Court found in 1934 in the Olson case that it's got to be an existing use on the date of the transaction, or it's got to be one where evidence shows it to be so reasonably likely in the near future that that use would affect its market price. In other words, if there's a lot of risky steps, many risky steps in advance of you, hey, that ultimate production stage cannot be the highest and best use because we'd be violating this right here. Here's an example. Many of you know this slide. I used that in a course I gave for University of Tulsa over 25 or 30 years or something like that, starting in 1985. And here, the value of any property increases from the raw land stage through unpermitted prospects, further studies, permitting, maybe we get to a permitted undeveloped mine site, and then with financing and construction, we get in. That's, of course, what happens. Here's a guy, it's actually me about 40 years ago, or maybe 50 years ago, do I hit any higher? Okay. You know, looking at some raw land and then having some ideas to try to get this process going, whereas in the other end, we have production. That's the rock in the box, okay? So the value of the mineral property increases, as we see here, and the key point is that at what stage is it on that date we do the valuation, the effective date? Where in between is that? Well, first of all, that highest and best use must, at least under the US PAP standards and also under US FLA that I talked about this morning, the use must be physically possible on the effective date. Number two, it must be legally permissible on that date. And number three, it must be financially feasible. And you know, how can you talk about financial feasibility if you're still at the raw land, or hey, you may have just a couple of drill holes, and that's all? How can you talk about financial feasibility? Of course, it's not production. Rather, it's, you know, using it for more drilling, getting more information about it, maybe swapping around, adding land so that you have a good position. Those can be the best uses. And finally, that use on the effective date must result in the maximum value. So if there can be multiple uses, is it a residential possibility for development, or is it going to be a sand and gravel quarry? Well, it cannot necessarily be true both at the same time. So which has the maximum value? To give a little more detail, what I showed you, those 4 blocks that increase the value, here it has been expanded. A Hardrock mineral expansion, maybe you can see it. You have you have an exploration environment, right? And then you notice some anomalies and something, then minerals have been identified. Then you have a prospect maybe at the scoping phase and so on, pre-feasibility, and then you get to a point, hey, now we have a financed and engineered mine at construction, go ahead, we're almost there. Now we have a new producing mine, and hey, now we have a mine with several years of production history. These are stages in more detail. We'll do the same with oil and gas. Here's a shale example. You know, starts out with just leased land, and maybe we have it over shale fairway, as we see several places in the country today. And it may already have been unitized. It may have well locations. It may have a vertical well, but still no lateral. It may be drilled horizontally, but hasn't been fracked yet. And then it may have been fracked, but not rested and tested. And maybe it's awaiting hookup. Now it's producing, not much record, and finally with some published history. In other words, we can identify any one of these stages for the property. The key being that, hey, if we're going to look for comparable sales or sales comparison candidates, then we need to know what is the property we're looking at, and then find some things that is as close as possible in the same highest and best use. So we determine that highest and best use. IMVAL now, the international thing, leaves us the selection of the appropriate valuation approaches and methods. That's the appraiser's prerogative to select that. IMVAL says methodology depends on the stage of use. Is it exploration? Are we now close to development? Are we at development, construction? Are we in production, or whatever, right? So here are these various things. Many of you have seen this before. There's three major prime methods of valuing minerals in the ground. And then for the early stages, here income method cannot be used. For the next stage where you have mineral resources defined, still no. But if we get into having reserves and so on, we might be able to use income method with care, and with producing properties, absolutely yes, that is the most relevant and reliable method. Sales comparison, by its definition, can be used all across the board if you just make darn sure that the candidates you're using, the candidate sales, are at or close to the same highest and best use, because then small adjustments may be possible. Okay, enough about that. Finally, IMVAL is the answer to all of this for the internationally particular, and we're happy to say we're off to a good start. 7 years down the road, next step will actually, I'll show in a minute, off to a good start. Third edition, unofficial Chinese, and we count a number of interested observers, and we hope to expand that. The challenges are then getting up a website like the Cicero website that many of you are familiar with. We at IMVAL, we are the next step after Cicero PRMS, next step after identifying the reserves and resources and reporting those. We are putting the dollar value to them. We're going to come up with a website and are proposing to IMVAL that we start assessing the various institutes. An annual member fee will be modest in the beginning, but that may get it possible to go to that step. And another thing, this is a hard task, and I'm the head of a subcommittee that has the job to try to communicate with other valuation organizations and so on. And of course, we want to increase the membership of Hunters and Association, and here the worst one, to somehow bridge the gap with the giant profession called the accounting profession, so we can speak the same language. Thanks a lot very much, and thanks for your attention. Any questions? Trevor?
This is more a statement. To my knowledge, the table you showed of the various stages and what approaches could be applied to the valuation, that's from SAMVAL and SIMVAL. SAMVAL have been adopted what SIMVAL has in it, but I don't believe that's in IMVAL or the SME valuation standards, and I oppose putting a table like that in a set of standards, because there's always going to be situations where that constrains the person from the appraiser from using innovative things or something that's appropriate for that particular situation, like appraising a royalty that they're going to earn an income out of, even if the property is not at one of those stages.
Good, thanks for that comment. Any other comments or questions? Otherwise, we'll go to Fred Pirkle.
Okay.